It's Miss Murphy. I'm here to read you a story today. This story is called The Spiffiest Giant in Town. That is the title of this story. It is written by Julia Donaldson and illustrated by Axel Schaeffler. So Axel drew the pictures and Julia wrote the story. This week we're focusing on a theme. The theme we're focusing on is fiction, and you will be able to identify or figure out parts of fiction books. So let's start with what fiction books are. Fiction books are stories that the author made up. So they're stories that we have read before. Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus is a fiction book. David's Drawings is a fiction book. A Fine Fine School is a fiction book. And Jamaica's Blue Marker is a fiction book. All of these are made up by the author to entertain us. So let's see about the spiffiest giant in town. Do you think this story is made up? What do we see on the cover? I see little mice and a pair of big feet, big giraffe. Let's see. George was a giant, the scruffiest giant in town. He always wore the same pair of old brown sandals and the same old patched up gown. I wish I wasn't the scruffiest giant in town, he said sadly. So we know that George is sad because his face looks very sad and he says something sadly. But what do we notice that the author could be making up? Yeah, the giant. We don't have giants like George in our town. This could be made up and could tell us it's a fiction book. But one day, George noticed a new shop. It was full of spiffy clothes, so he bought a spiffy shirt, a spiffy pair of pants, a spiffy belt, a spiffy striped tie, some spiffy socks with diamonds on the side, and a pair of spiffy, shiny shoes. Now I'm the spiffiest giant in town, he said proudly. So he got rid of his old gown and bought all these spiffy new clothes. What does spiffy mean? Think about what spiffy means. Yeah, probably like fancy. George left his old clothes behind in the store. He was about to go home when he heard a sound. On the sidewalk stood a giraffe who was sniffing sadly. "What's the matter?" asked George. "It's my neck," said the giraffe. "It's so long and so cold. I wish I had a warm scarf." What do we think George is going to do? So what else are we noticing that make us think this story might be made up? We already know that the giant makes me think this is made up, but now there's a giraffe on the street. This could tell me this author made up this story. "Cheer up," said George, and he took off his striped tie. "It didn't match my socks anyway," he said as he wrapped it around the giraffe's neck. "It made a wonderful scarf." "Thank you," said the giraffe. As George walked home, he sang to himself, "My tie is a scarf for a cold giraffe, but look me up and down, I'm the spiffiest giant in town." So George took off his spiffy tie and gave it over to the giraffe for a scarf. That was nice of him. George came to a river. On a boat stood a goat who was bleating loudly. "What's the matter?" asked George. "It's my sail," said the goat. "It blew away in a storm. I wish I had a strong new sail for my boat." So now his boat doesn't have a sail. What do you think George is going to do? And I'm noticing this other animal makes me think this story is made up. Cheer up, said George, and he took off his new white shirt. It kept coming untucked anyway, he said, as he tied it to the mast of the goat's boat. It made a magnificent sail. Thank you, said the goat. George walked on, singing to himself, my tie is a scarf for a cold draft, my shirt's on a boat as a sail for a goat, but look me up and down, I'm the spiffiest giant in town. George came to a tiny, ruined house. Beside the house stood a white mouse, with lots of baby mice. They were all squeaking. What's the matter? Asked George. It's our house, squeaked the mother mouse. It burned down and now we have nowhere to live. I wish we had a nice new house. Oh no. Cheer up, said George, and he took off one of his shiny shoes. It was giving me blisters anyway, he said, as the mouse and her baby scrambled inside. The shoe made a perfect home for them. Thank you, they squeaked. George had to hop along the road now, but he didn't mind. As he hopped, he sang to himself, my tie is a scarf for a cold draft. My shirt's on a boat as a sail for a goat. My shoe is a house for a little white mouse. But look me up and down, I'm the spiffiest giant in town. So he's still feeling really good about himself. But these things make me think this story is made up. George came to a campsite. Beside a tent stood a fox, who was crying. What's the matter? Asked George. It's my sleeping bag, said the fox. I dropped it in a puddle. I wish I had a warm, dry sleeping bag. What do you think George is going to give him? Cheer up, said George, and he took off one of his socks with diamonds on the sides. It was tickling my nose anyway, he said, as the fox snuggled into it. It made a very fine sleeping bag. Thank you, said the fox. George hopped on, singing to himself, my tie is a scarf for a cold draft, my shirt's on a boat as a sail for a goat, my shoe is a house for a little white mouse, one of my socks is a bed for a fox, but look me up and down, I'm the spiffiest giant in town. So he is still loving life. George came to a big, squishy bog. Beside the bog stood a dog, who was howling. What's the matter? Asked George. It's this bog, said the dog. I need to get across, but I keep getting stuck in the mud. I wish there was a safe, dry path. So I heard a new word. A bog is like this path of mud that you can't get through. Cheer up, said George, and he took off his spiffy new belt. It was squeezing my tummy anyway, he said as he laid it down over the bog. It made an excellent path. Thank you, said the dog. The wind started to blow, but George didn't mind. He hopped on, singing to himself, my tie is a scarf for a cold draft, my shirt's on a boat as a sail for a goat, my shoe is a house for a little white mouse, one of my socks is a bed for a fox, my belt helped a dog who was crossing a bog, but my pants are falling down. I'm the coldest giant in town. Suddenly, George felt sad and cold and not all spiffy. He stood on one foot and thought, I'll have to go back to the shop and buy some more clothes, he decided. He turned around and hopped all the way back to the shop. But when he got there, it was closed. Oh no, cried George. He sank down on the sidewalk and a tear ran down his face. He felt as sad as all the animals he had met on his way home. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a bag with something familiar poking out of the top. He took a closer look. What do you think it is? My gown, he yelled. My dear old gown and old sandals. George put them on. They felt wonderfully comfortable. I'm the coziest giant in town, he cried, and he danced back home along the road. Outside his front door stood all the animals he had helped. They were carrying an enormous present. "Come on, George," they said. "Open it." George untied the ribbon. Inside was a beautiful gold paper crown and a card. "Look inside the card, George," said the animals. George put the crown on his head and opened the card. Inside it said, so all the animals got him a little card, and the card said, "You gave your scarf to a cold draft, your shirt's on a boat, as a sail for a goat, your shoe is a house for a little white mouse, and one of your socks is a bed for a fox. Your belt helped a dog who was crossing a bog, so here is a very fine crown to go with your sandals and gown, for the kindest giant in town." So that was a really great story. What did he learn? Think about what he learned in this story, and also think about some of the parts in this story we talked about that make this a fiction story. Remember, fiction books are stories the author made up. So think about those things today.